Kia ora, welcome to Parliament TV. The first story in this hour comes from the TVNZ Digital Production Library.
After the first MMP, mixed member proportional, general election in 1996, the New Zealand First Party held the balance of power. The assignment program tracked the process of forming our first MMP government.
Good evening and welcome to this assignment special. It's the political marriage of the decade, the coalition between New Zealand First and National. Their courtship was long and secretive, and it produced the most detailed prenuptial agreement this country has ever seen. Tonight we talk with the negotiators who were intimately involved in the deal making. We reveal how the political suitors struck their bargain and why Labour's overtures to New Zealand First were rejected. Here's Richard Harman on New Zealand's most famous marriage of convenience.
We made good progress.
No comments on the meeting. Yes, we'll meet again.
Did you make any progress today?
I think it's a question of adjusting expectations.
No comment on that either.
Can you give us any indication?
Negotiating timetable.
I think you can gather by now I'm not making any comment.
Free for all that could put the economy at risk. Boy, do you want to have things done responsibly?
Well, you were the politician who said there'd be no deals in smoke-filled rooms, Mr. Peters.
For 8.5 weeks after the election on October the 12th, Wellington was in a state of limbo. Political party leaders came and went, journalists besieged them for answers. And if MMP supporters had hoped that it would usher in a new age of openness in government, they'd be disappointed. Because what was going on behind the closed doors of the committee rooms in Parliament was going on under the tightest secrecy.
Can you tell us how the talks went today?
Well, like every other day.
Well, this room, for example, was even swept for bugs. And it was in here that some of the most sensitive talks between New Zealand First and First National, and then Labour, took place. Those discussions are still covered by formal secrecy agreements. But tonight, we're going to try and strip away that secrecy and try and report what did happen during the secret talks to form the government.
Mr. Peters named a 5-person negotiating team, high-ranking party MPs and brother Wayne, who's a lawyer. About the same time, the caretaker Prime Minister was naming his negotiating team, party officials, senior MPs and newcomer Georgina Tuhiuhiu.
He knows all the Maori members in the New Zealand First Party personally, and no comment.
In fact, each party's selection of negotiators was to prove critical. Throughout this process, personal chemistry would play as big, if not bigger, role than policy concessions. David Carter is National MP for Banks Peninsula. He watched the whole process from the back bench.
Once we held our first caucus, there was the opportunity then to discuss the negotiating team, and we all had a chance then to make comment on who we felt should carry the mantle and do the negotiating, and that was resolved very well unanimously.
What were the criteria that you used for the negotiating team?
Well, I wanted to make sure from my point of view that I saw people there with talent, that understood the policy issues, were able to negotiate sensibly with New Zealand First, because I suspected right along that I don't think they had at that stage well defined some of their policy, and people that would hold to National Party principles.
That was why Max Bradford, although he's been out of favour with Jim Bolger, found himself on the negotiating team. But National also played a clever tactical card. It appointed a new MP, Georgina Tuhiuhiu, to the team, and almost immediately her rapport with New Zealand First's Māori MPs was obvious. And Labour, in what for Helen Clark was potentially a dangerous move, appointed her rival, Mike Moore, to their team. He's one of the few Labour MPs who had a personal relationship with Winston Peters and some New Zealand First MPs.
That wasn't in my mind when I asked Mike to play a role. What was in my mind was that Mike had done a lot of negotiating. He had worked for 6 years as Minister of Overseas Trade, and I felt he had a knack for it. That's why I chose to involve him.
But you must have asked yourself the question about what his relationship with Winston Peters and Ron Mark would mean in terms of the negotiations.
I knew he had a close personal relationship with Ron Mark, and it was my judgment that it wouldn't do the negotiations any harm for that relationship to be there.
And then there were the players on the sidelines, like long-time Peters confidant Michael Laws, in constant touch with the New Zealand First negotiators and suggesting early on that a deal with National could be on.
I think the Alliance have got some internal problems to work out in the next 7 to 10 days, but they may be the reason why Winston Peters has to consider, and the New Zealand First Caucus, a centre-right coalition, with them being the centre part in coalescing with National.
Helen Clark believes Laws's influence was critical.
We did not know whether there was a secret agenda driven by Mr Laws to use Labor simply to bid National up.
Do you believe that was the case?
On Mr Laws' strategic thinking, I'm sure it was.
Laws, in turn, makes no secret of his distaste for some Labor politicians.
The arrogance, the haughtiness, the air of superiority that people like Clark and particularly Cullen showed to New Zealand First negotiating team, and indeed to the whole New Zealand First Caucus, was quite a shock and a revelation to many of the new MPs who might have otherwise been favourably disposed towards giving Labor the nod.
Oh, I don't think that's a fair criticism. They spent much of their time complaining about the fact that Mr Bolger lectured them all the time and wouldn't stop talking, which did sound right to us as a sort of general suggestion.
I think it's important that we don't allow our disappointment to cloud our memories. My memories were of constructive engagement, of generous goodwill, and I think in the main people went in good faith. Part of it was difficult. You had people who'd never been in Parliament trying to rewrite the parliamentary standing orders, who'd never sat in a cabinet saying, well, can't you put health ministry alongside another great ministry? And just physically a minister couldn't do that. So it was a way of bringing people up to speed and assisting the process without being condescending or arrogant. And some people found that difficult, I think.
Neil Curtin is New Zealand First's health spokesman, and he was involved in many of the policy negotiations.
It was easy with Labor. Their policy was very similar to ours, and certainly in philosophy there was a fundamental shift. We had to unbundle a decade of reform, of health reform, and that particular hurdle for National was almost insurmountable, and went right to the wire on that.
Well, let's deal with Labor. How long did the talks with them about health last?
Not long at all, really. It was about detail with Labor. We really had to hammer out exactly what we meant by our words and just move on from there. But there was no difficulty with that. There was good understanding between parties on where we needed to go.
Did Mr Peters contact you personally to reassure you that National didn't have...
For their part, Labor found New Zealand First a frustrating group to deal with.
Well, things were very slow to start with because I don't think they'd worked out ever how to conduct the negotiations. And so it began with a kind of, each side prancing around, trying to get each other's measure. And it took a while for things to develop. For the first couple of weeks there were rather formal discussions about number of places in a cabinet, that kind of thing. And we were always told that 15 was their absolute preference. They came back several times on that. There was also some quite lengthy general discussion about the economic situation, what might be done to change it. 2 to 3 weeks into the talks, we began to look at very detailed policy papers for the two parties. But then as time began to run out, that was abandoned, and we moved to these executive summaries where a lot was encapsulated in a couple of pages for each topic.
But when National's finance team met New Zealand First, they must have been nervous. New Zealand First still wanted to use National's next round of tax cuts to fund more social spending and to set up a compulsory superannuation scheme. We'll be back in a moment to ask what role late-night drinks played in forging the deal. The Reserve Bank is straight across the terrace in Wellington from Winston Peters' old office in Bowen House.
Are you here to brief Dr Brash or be briefed by Dr Brash?
Well, I'm just here to talk to Dr Brash.
Though they might have been neighbours, Mr Peters and the bank were poles apart in terms of the way they would run monetary policy. Repeatedly on the campaign trail, Mr Peters had accused the bank of being too tight, of having too narrow a focus on 0 to 2% inflation.
Every time there's any chance of any growth, it is choked off. You're going to have higher interest rates, and we are way below the level of economic expansion to even employ the children who will leave our secondary schools next year.
Were the talks constructive?
Yeah, they were very helpful.
But after an afternoon with Dr. Brash, Mr. Peters emerged not as a critic, but sounding more like a supporter of the bank.
Without disclosing the details, I did appreciate the time we spent with the Governor of the Reserve Bank. I think that we're all older and wiser now.
Later, Peters would say that it was Don Brash who was making the compromises at this meeting.
I think there was an understanding that we had picked up from a wide section of the marketplace and also economic opinion, that things had been too rigid and that they understood or came halfway towards our position of greater flexibility with monetary policy.
While Mr. Peters was having formal policy talks with people like Don Brash by day, by night both Labour and National tried to occupy him with informal talks. These informal encounters hit the headlines after an altercation between Mr. Peters and a patron at this Wellington bar. And when it was revealed Mike Moore was there as well, attention turned to Wellington by night.
Wellington's fashionable Il Casino restaurant, always a favourite haunt of politicians, but during the coalition talks, Mr. Peters was to come here frequently. He had dinner here with the Labour negotiators, with Mike Moore, with his old friend, the former National Cabinet Minister Philip Burden, and with Mr. Bolger's Chief Press Secretary, Richard Griffin.
National had a deliberate strategy to try and win back Mr. Peters' confidence that he'd lost when he left the party in 1992. In fact, restaurants all over Wellington regularly hosted those involved in the talks. The Green Parrot was another Peters favourite, but after its initial notoriety, the Brava Bar played a central role.
There's been quite a few politicians that have been in. I think Helen Clark made a brief appearance. She was here at the theatre recently. Mr. Preble was meant to come in, but hasn't been here. But there's been a few faces. Winston Peters' brother was here the other night for dinner. Yeah, there's been quite a few people coming. It's been great.
Just by the look of what you've seen, has it been sort of like informal negotiations taking place here, or what's been their mood?
Well, they do tell us to turn the music down a little bit when they are in here, and they are sort of engrossed in heavy conversations, so that'd probably answer your question there.
Exchange of papers?
Well, that's, you know, if you want to ask me which way it's going, I think I'm in probably a good position to know now.
Which way?
I'd have to say, if I had to take a punt, I'd have to say it's definitely going national from what I've seen happening in my restaurant.
And back at Parliament, Mr. Bolger was also having his own private sessions with Mr. Peters.
Well, we had good discussions from the beginning. There were no bad days in the sense that we thought, well, look, both of us or one of us had blown it. It was a matter of detailed progressions through issues, and that's why all the meetings were held. And then we went to some informal meetings, and then what could be informals, if you like, where even sitting in each other's offices, having a glass of beer late in the evening, we talked through some of the issues. But that was not where the hard grind was done. But that, I think, developed a confidence that we could work with each other.
When you were alone in either your office or his office with Mr. Peters, obviously you would have talked some policy, but equally obviously when two politicians get together they talk about more than that. What were you talking about that enabled you to rebuild your relationship?
Oh, the broad spectrum of recent New Zealand political history and even world history, because we both are enthusiasts in terms of the grand sweep of political thought. I suppose some would describe it as re-establishing a confidence in each other that we could work together. But it wasn't only with the two of us. There were others who were doing equally the same. Other members of my negotiating team were doing exactly the same, building a sense of confidence and trust with other members of New Zealand First, particularly the other negotiators in New Zealand First. And out of that, I think we developed the ability, in fact, to find the necessary compromises to bring together the final policies.
Were you ever able to understand or establish how it was that Winston Peters and you got so far offside with each other?
It may seem surprising we didn't spend a moment's discussion on that.
We'll be back after the break to look at how New Zealand First applied psychological pressure to Labour and National as the deadline for Parliament to meet drew closer.
Isn't that amazing?
That's right.
Where's the break?
Quick.
No.
Like Winston Peters, Peter Witahera is from Northland's Ngāti Wai. He invented the power beat battery, and when he opened a new assembly line at his Hamilton factory, it provided the perfect excuse for Mr. Peters to go public for the first time since the election. And what Peters had to say was plainly intended to be heard back in Wellington by the National and Labour negotiators. He was emphasising economic issues, but in a way very different to the way National usually talked.
That government must address areas of need crying out for attention, a health care system that is neither affordable nor available now to all, an education system that ill serves many of the children passing through it, whether they be European or Maori, and a business community and an export community in particular that is now struggling, and some are reeling under high interest and exchange rates.
But that sort of talk was worrying National's right wing, giving rise to rumours that some would sooner be in opposition than in a government with New Zealand First.
Well, if those MPs had a shred of integrity, they would have told the leadership of their party straight up. My job and my colleagues' responsibility is to present a united caucus decision. That's what they are responsible for as well. And if they intend to codicil or caveat their leadership's negotiations, then they should have said so a long time ago.
The next day, one right-wing minister, Maurice Williamson, confirmed he was one of those who had concerns about a deal with New Zealand First. He was worried National's negotiators were giving away too much.
If those compromises become significant and if they become crucial to the sort of cornerstones that have underpinned the recovery and where this nation is, then I would find it very difficult to stay within that. I'd actually find it being unfaithful to the voters of this constituency.
The catch of the day has to go to Rana Waita.
Thank you.
But Winston Peters knew there was also potential trouble in his own caucus.
Holding my fish.
If National's came from its right, his came from his left. New Zealand First MPs, particularly Māori, worried they could never sell a deal with National. So he took them all fishing. Also on board, a close friend of Mr. Peters, Tom Gear, a Tauranga lawyer and businessman who's also a friend of National's Attorney General, Paul East, and Mr. Bulger's Chief Press Secretary, Richard Griffin.
It's a bit hard for ourselves on this quota up here, though, Rana.
Well, we haven't got a government, but we've got fish.
These personal networks gave National a confidence a deal could be done. But if a deal was done with National, then Tukuroirangi Morgan was going to have major problems with it.
Since I became the Member of Parliament for Te Taihawauru, I went to 3 major gatherings where several hundred people attended, and when I rose to my feet and I said to them all, tell me what your preference is, and then I will tell you what the issues are, and remind you that thousands of our people walked away from the Labour Party because they were sick of being marginalised and they were sick of the mediocrity and the apathy. Having said that to the people, their preference was for Labour.
Even John Delamere, widely regarded throughout the negotiations as sympathetic to National, was facing pressure from his marae to stick with Labour. Plainly, the Māori MPs would be critical. But not only New Zealand First's Māori base were worrying about a deal with National, Peters' new grey power would not welcome it either.
As we go to make this decision, we're in a no-win situation. We're going to disappoint a great number of our supporters, our party members, and a significant proportion of the public of this country.
A less than enthusiastic reaction, and had they heard his post-speech press conference, they might have been even less enthusiastic, because there was the first hint New Zealand First was no longer committed to compulsory superannuation as a non-negotiable bottom line.
The savings of this country, the long-term independence of this country, issues dependent upon a super policy in our view, and we are very, very strongly arguing for it, and we'll go on arguing for it the remaining time that we're in these negotiations. We'll have to wait and see what the outcome is, but we've got a certain degree of confidence about it.
Tuesday, December the 2nd, this was supposed to be D-Day, the day when New Zealand First would present its final coalition offer to both the National and the Labour caucuses. But there are more delays. We understand that this time those delays centre on who would get what job in the coalition cabinet. 3 days later, National's caucus met. The New Zealand Herald said National's negotiators had already agreed to drop next year's tax cuts, so the money could be spent on the social spending New Zealand First wanted. Paul East was not only one of National's formal negotiators, but also an important link in National's informal network, which was keeping in personal touch with Mr. Peters. How would you feel about deferring the tax cuts?
Well, it's Wednesday now, and we have the House sitting supposedly next week. I think the fairest thing to say is that these sort of issues have still to be resolved, both with the New Zealand First caucus and the National caucus. Most of the time in the last few weeks has been taken up with detailed policy consideration, some of it about what may be considered by the public to be relatively minor matters, but are important to either party.
That afternoon, National's caucus would begin to think about the politics of the situation. How could they sell dropping the tax cuts to an electorate they'd promised them to only a few weeks earlier? Would they face another backlash like they did when they reneged on their promise to cut the super surtax? A possible way out might be if Mr. Peters dropped his demand for compulsory superannuation.
Clearly, he's got a policy there that's quite substantially different to ours. We've got to work our way through that if we're going to be in the final coalition government.
If you looked around your caucus, which way would you think it would be likely to go on that?
With compulsory super, I don't think the majority of our caucus would favour compulsory superannuation.
Substantial speculation this morning in the New Zealand Herald about tax cuts. You pinned your campaign to the tax cuts. Can you afford to give them away?
It'd be very disappointing if we have to. But when you say we pinned our campaign to it, what I said and what I heard the Prime Minister say is you deliver us into government and we'll deliver the tax cuts. The people spoke, they didn't give us a majority situation, so the tax cuts now are on the table.
Like the rest of the caucus, David Carter went home, but was told to be on standby to fly back to Wellington at the shortest notice. With Christmas decorations now firmly in place in Wellington shops, and with just 6 days to go before Parliament met, the pressure was on. And then pure street theatre. Mr. Peters, Mike Moore and Wayne Peters, Winston's brother and a lawyer and key New Zealand First negotiator, go for a cup of coffee in a Lambton Quay cafe. Why?
Well, I think it was pretty obvious that if Winston wanted a private meeting with Mike Moore, it would have been in private. It was pretty obvious that the photograph on the front page of the Dominion was meant to send a message somewhere, and as I understand it, it was received loud and clear.
And who was it meant to send the message to?
A meeting like that might well make the other side believe that there was a hint of palliness there that might be to their neglect.
When you're up in Barnhouse and you're talking, it's time for lunch, I say, let's get up some sandwiches. Winston says, I'm sick of this building, let's go for a walk and have a cup of coffee and a sandwich down the road. Yes. Okay. And next minute, all the media on top.
Jonathan Boston's a Victoria University political scientist who's making a study of the whole coalition forming process. He found we did it differently to the way it's done in other proportional representation systems.
In effect, the negotiations took double the amount of time that is the norm overseas. A second difference related to the way that the New Zealand First Party conducted simultaneous parallel negotiations with the two major parties. What is unusual, however, is that this process went on for a very long time, and that in a sense the two parties tended for the right to govern. They put forward to New Zealand First detailed negotiated coalition agreements. That is not normal internationally, Normally, you wouldn't get to the stage of the two major parties in a system negotiating right up to the last minute over a huge range of policy matters and essentially tendering for the right to govern.
The policy talks were now all but over. Now the politics would take over. We'll be back in a moment with more from inside the coalition-making process. Friday, December the 6th, 5 days before Parliament must meet. Wellington begins the day to find an inner-city cinema complex on fire. Traffic's jammed. Back down at Parliament, Jim Bolger will spend 3 hours with Winston Peters. National is now down to the final detail.
Long day.
And Mr. Peters has a brief meeting with Helen Clark. She's now ready to present a series of understandings with New Zealand First to her caucus the next day. Labour's caucus, believing they were New Zealand First's obvious choice, are becoming frustrated at how long the coalition talks are taking. Do you think you could reach a decision today?
I would hope so. I think the public of New Zealand have been shut out of the election process for 2 months now. It would probably be a good idea to bring them back into it and be able to give them some information on what's happening.
We had a meeting this morning to decide what our bottom lines are, and I think I'm very confident that we're going to be the government next week.
Throughout the election campaign, New Zealand First had attacked Labour over its spending proposals. Labour wanted to spend more on health and education, and it was going to fund that by raising taxes, something else New Zealand First was opposed to. Labour was later to brief Alliance leader Jim Anderton on the deal they offered New Zealand First. They told Anderton they agreed to drop their tax increases in their offer to Mr. Peters.
Now, as I understand it, they had to drop that. So they had no extra revenue coming in at all for their social package, which made it even worse in that sense. So New Zealand First's mad prescription that you couldn't raise taxes but you could spend all the extra money was really, in Labour's case, almost a terminal illness in terms of the viability of the package, in my view. But nevertheless, Peters was going along a fair way to sign up to it, but clearly there were some real problems, and one of them was that he wanted to be Minister of Finance.
In fact, New Zealand First indirectly proposed an even bigger role for Mr. Peters in a New Zealand First Labour government.
What Labour's position was that the Prime Ministership could not be shared. It was suggested to me by someone outside the negotiating team first that it should be.
Who was that?
I'm not prepared to name names.
A New Zealand First MP?
I'm not prepared to name names, but my response was, well, where has this been done before in the world? And the answer was Turkey and Israel, at which point I pointed out that these weren't exactly models of successful economies and societies. Be that as it may, my bottom line always was that Labour must have the Prime Ministership and the leadership of the government, as I believe our vote suggested was appropriate. And secondly, that as Prime Minister, I did have a right to have the person I had the most confidence in as Minister of Finance.
But because of its proposal to be a bigger spending government, Labour knew it faced a credibility problem with the financial markets, and Helen Clark believed only Michael Cullen as Finance Minister could overcome that. Even so, on the Saturday, she was still confident she could do a deal.
I've always been cautiously optimistic. I've never overstated Labour's chances. I think it's always been a close-run thing.
Sunday, National's turn, and they still had policy decisions to make. Neil Curtin still didn't have a deal on health.
It got right down to the purchaser provision split and versus a funding position. That is at the core of New Zealand First's health policy.
Now, this meeting in the Beehive on Sunday was to deal with the crunch issues, wasn't it?
Essentially it was, yes. There were some fundamentals there that had to be dealt with in terms of foreign investment and a whole range of issues of that ilk.
Did you get the impression at that meeting in the Beehive that National really wanted to do a deal?
National very much wanted to do a deal. It was imperative from Mr Bolger's leadership point of view that we got the deal, and they were very, very pragmatic in their approach.
The meeting dragged on all afternoon. By now, the media, sensing a decision was near, were there in droves. Later, Winston Peters would say the health concessions were critical in terms of selling any national deal to his caucus.
Well, there is no doubt that I think in the minds of Caucus, going with national would have been, it always was perceived to be so much more difficult to sell politically, when at the same time we had made enormous strides on social policy and export policy. But it was still at the back of their minds this concern. That's going to be so difficult to sell. And Mr Curtin is pointing to a key area, health. We wanted health changes, and we had to argue for them. Caucus, that's new, but then again...
But now, with the policy talks over with National and Labour, New Zealand First could begin to work on what would turn out to be the key to the final detail, the size of the cabinet, their share of positions in it, and most importantly, Mr Peters' own role. These negotiations would be left to Mr Peters' brother Wayne. But all along, particularly with National, there had been informal talk about giving Winston Peters a senior financial role. For Jim Bolger, these would be critical decisions. National were unhappy with New Zealand First's proposal of a 15-person cabinet. That would mean sacking existing cabinet ministers, and sacked ministers, as Mr Bolger knew, could become political opponents.
Well, cabinet had been discussed on and off from very early in the negotiations without attempting to reach finality. And it was on the Monday we started to have very detailed discussions. We in fact continued those into the Tuesday, and it was somewhat fluid in the sense that there were a number of different combinations that were suggested, and there was issues like 16 inside, 4 outside, 16 inside, outside, and so on, starting off with the New Zealand First position of 15 in total, 10 to the National Party, 5 to themselves. Clearly, I would have had to sack over half the cabinet ministers. That would do nothing for the stability of the new coalition government and so on.
Labour, though, continued to resist giving Mr Peters the senior finance job.
We took the very strong view that by far the larger party in a coalition of this sort would expect to have the job of Minister of Finance and overall budgetary and economic responsibility.
And then, on Monday afternoon, New Zealand First went back to Labour with another idea. Obviously, they'd agreed to National's proposal to increase the cabinet to 20. Would Labour agree to that too?
And that was one of the things which, to my mind, began to suggest very strongly that what they were really about at the leadership level was trying to get deals with us which was close as possible to that which they'd got with National. So the caucus could be told, their caucus could be told there was no essential difference on these points.
But National's caucus was still signing off the policy concessions that had been made the day before at the crunch meetings in the Beehive. First, caucus had to agree to some big changes to the health reforms.
Well, I think the whole of caucus was saying, whilst we might strongly believe in the direction we were heading, we haven't been able to take the population of New Zealand with us, and we've got to be prepared to modify and take and get their support for our health system.
Well, next issue, foreign investment. That was a gut issue on the campaign for New Zealand First. It was an issue that divided National and New Zealand First on the campaign. How are you able to resolve that?
Clearly, foreign people who want to invest, particularly in our farmland, are here to make an active contribution to New Zealand. That's fair, I can live with that. What I would have had difficulty living with was any suggestion by New Zealand First that we had to stop foreign investment per se. I think from the National Party point of view, we're all nervous about the tax cuts and the broken promises. If there's going to be a significant increase in expenditure, we fiscally can't have the tax cuts as well. So I think there will be a means of deferring them for a year and hoping then that New Zealand First, as part of our coalition, will work towards further tax cuts.
How do you feel about having to explain that to your electorate, which still embraces a large section of Ruth Richardson's old electorate?
It's MMP in the workings. If the National Party is able to then do a deal with the New Zealand First and have a coalition government which defers tax cuts, that's significantly better than the alternative, which is a New Zealand First Labor Party government, which in fact Labor Party campaigned throughout our electorate saying they're going to increase taxes.
So National had made its policy concessions. The caucus had agreed. Now the only question left was whether Mr Bolger could agree to give Winston Peters the top finance job. As Monday night wore on, first Mr Peters and Paul East and Richard Griffin discussed the idea. Then Wayne Peters, Mr Bolger and Bill Birch discussed it. Peters himself stayed out of that session in another Beehive office with East and Griffin.
We looked then at a number of possible permutations, and the last one I put to them, it was really to Winston's brother Wayne, was the question of a broadly similar mix as the Australians have, the Treasurer in the senior role and the Minister of Finance, but they are quite distinct roles.
Now it would be a long wait for the final New Zealand First decision, a wait that will be accompanied by some very peculiar suspicions from New Zealand First.
Is it going to be a good day?
It's going to be a lovely day.
Are you feeling the pressure this morning, to form a government?
Well, I think you know the answer to that.
For most of them, it would be the biggest day so far of their short political lives. For New Zealand First's caucus, it would be an intensive day, comparing overhead slides outlining the respective positions of National and Labor on over 30 key policies. But first, their leader had his suspicions.
Can TV3 show TV1 out there? Trying to listen to this conversation.
He worried a One Network News microwave dish and other microwave dishes on neighbouring buildings might be bugging the caucus meeting.
Come on.
My microwave doesn't look like that.
Can somebody phone her up and say, would you please leave?
So they decided to conduct the whole decision-making caucus meeting in a sort of code.
We had the various positions set out very clearly on the board, and each spokesperson would go through it and each question would be asked on the basis of that one over there versus that one over there. And I'm not being paranoid about it, but when you see a device set up outside your room as you begin your caucus meeting, and when they're told to go away, you see one being set up just down over there, we could see it right on that post office building, you begin to wonder what's going on. We just took a precaution.
Did you have a concern that the markets were trying to signal?
No, but if the information had been got unfairly to one player in the markets, that would have given them an enormous advantage.
Meanwhile, Wayne Peters was continuing his negotiations with National over the Cabinet and Winston's role as Treasurer. New Zealand First also had a new list of concessions it wanted, some like a $300,000 request for extra funding from the Commissioner of Children, put to them by the Commissioner himself. These had been produced only around midnight the night before. In the mid-afternoon, Paul East went across to Bowen House to tell New Zealand First National was ready to agree to the Treasurer's role for Mr Peters and the new concessions.
Mr Anderson, how are things going to go this morning, do you think?
Labor and New Zealand First between them had only 54 seats in the Parliament. They therefore needed the Alliance's 13 to win confidence motions. But in a statement that morning, issued while the New Zealand First caucus was meeting, it became clear the Alliance was willing to offer only an ambiguous pledge of support.
Well, of course, there has to be some opting out clause. Otherwise, you're basically saying that we have to support them no matter what they do.
The Alliance's position was presented to Caucus, and at that point, there was an audible sigh in the room that it was all over. The Alliance had presented us with a no deal. That, to my way of thinking, was virtually the end of the trail for Labor, and it was sad for those people. There was a lot of feeling from a number of my caucus colleagues for Labor, and somewhat a considerable sadness at that point that the game was lost.
The Alliance gave New Zealand First no valid reason for opting out at all. In fact, at the beginning of the process, I expected some difficulty with the Alliance. In the event, the Alliance bent over backwards to help us out. I cannot fault the way that they handled the discussions we had.
By now, it was late afternoon, and Tauhanari, who had close links to Labor, made one final bid to get Labor on side.
He really was looking for that last gasp, if you like, from Labor, and he wanted to be clear and sure that Labor weren't prepared to give up that position in terms of Treasury.
It was a very brief conversation, and I didn't get any indication from the person who rang that the call was about negotiating. I was simply asked whether I was firm on Dr. Cullen being Minister of Finance. I said, I have to be. I was thanked for my opinion and the phone was hung up.
And when Toe came back and said, no, Helen Clark says she...
Toe didn't share that with us. I think he wanted to know in his own mind that there was no chance.
I believe that the Labor Party treated the Maori MPs with contempt and with arrogance.
When you talk about arrogance and contempt towards the Maori MPs, what do you mean?
I was disappointed that they did not offer Winston the Minister of Finance. I was disappointed that in terms of the cabinet numbers, that it was considerably less than that which the National Party offered.
Yeah, no, stay put, I'm afraid. It's all going to happen in the next half hour. Okay, bye. It's just one line.
By now, the New Zealand journalists covering the decision were joined 14 floors below the New Zealand First caucus room by a number of international journalists. In effect, this was the final part of New Zealand's election night. But now, with the evening news bulletins beginning, it was finally time for Winston Peters to tell his caucus his preferred coalition partner.
What did you say in your final address to the caucus?
Really, we're in a unique position. We are people who are going to decide the next government. No New Zealanders have ever been in that circumstance like we have before. And our responsibility is to do what's right for the country. That ideally, in an ideal world, we wouldn't be dealing with either Labor or National because they were the reasons why this party was founded. But in the real world, we had to find a government for the people of New Zealand, that there would be disappointment and vitriol and bitterness and criticism, all of which has emerged. Ignore all that and do your duty.
But after he'd spoken to the caucus, Peters would also try one last piece of brinkmanship. He sent Brother Wayne back across to the Beehive with another list of demands, this time on Māori issues. Peters knew that his Māori MPs would be the most difficult to convince to go with National. Jim Bolger joined the last-minute discussions in Doug Graham's office. Finally, he agreed to make more concessions. Now, even New Zealand First's Māori MPs were ready to do a deal with National. For Tuku Morgan, it was an emotional moment.
I felt a sense of betrayal because my grandfather and my parents have voted Labour. My own marae is split down the middle with New Zealand First and Labour. But that was yesterday. This is today. And we have to arm ourselves with the best kind of tools. We have to search for a better tomorrow. And that better tomorrow didn't come under the banner of the Labour Party. It came under a coalition agreement between National and New Zealand First.
And then, one by one, the members of the New Zealand First caucus and council spoke. They would all agree to a deal with National.
It was a matter of saying our heart may be in one position, but here it is. We have a business proposition in front of us, and we made a call on that.
But still, the media would have to wait till the Australian Stock Exchange closed before Mr. Peters would agree to announce the decision.
Here's Mr. Bolger.
And then, one last piece of political theatre. Tauhanari would take a letter to Mr. Bolger and deliver it to him exactly at a time synchronised with Mr. Peters' public announcement.
I'm terribly sorry. Can you please... Oh, Tom.
Party President Doug Woollerton would do the same for Helen Clark. But Mr. Peters and the letters were out of sync. Both leaders would hear the announcement on TV. The relief National ministers felt was palpable.
Well, I'm very satisfied, obviously. We've worked very hard, and it has been a matter of trying to reach consensus on a number of quite difficult issues.
Silly question. After all these negotiations, how does it feel?
Well, the process itself has been a good one, and it's been hard work, but I think potentially the outcomes will be very good.
New Zealand First, though, seemed shell-shocked.
How easy do you think this decision is going to be to sell to Tai Tonga?
It's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult.
Within minutes, people began to flock to Winston's office.
Winston's done brilliantly. I'm going to be with my mate. He's done superbly. It's amazing to think that the economic policy of New Zealand First is going to become the economic policy of, hello Graham, of New Zealand for the next 3 years. No, he's had a fantastic night, and to be Treasurer, just superb.
And even national MPs went to toast the man they'd last toasted when they kicked him out of their caucus in 1992. Even Mr Bolger would eventually join the party. But Mr Peters would not allow cameras in his office. Only the departing Bellamy's trolleys testified to how jubilant the celebrations were. But the next day, there was a chance to reflect on this whole deal.
It is quite common overseas for the minor party or the junior party in a coalition to be overpaid in terms of cabinet posts. But in the context of the negotiated settlement here in New Zealand First has been very significantly overpaid. We have a situation where the party which has just over a quarter of the seats in the executive, 17 out of 61 seats, is in effect getting around 45% of the positions in the executive as from October 1998. Now that's an extraordinary situation.
Who will lead the coalition at into the next election?
You've got to remember that's a question for largely the National Party.
What would happen in the event that you cease to be Prime Minister? How is your replacement selected? Is it automatically the Deputy Prime Minister, or is it automatically the next leader of the National Party?
Next leader of the National Party. I mean, the next leader of the National Party as the largest party in the coalition would almost certainly be the Prime Minister. You note the document says that the leader of the New Zealand First Party shall be, in fact, the Deputy Prime Minister. So I don't think there's any real debate in that area. That's something for the future, and I'm not planning to go, so we needn't worry about it.
If I asked you to say, what sort of a man is Jim Bolger, what would you say?
Well, I'm not going to, answer those sorts of questions, other than to say we've gone into an arrangement where we have to trust each other.
Do you?
Have to work with it. Yes, I do trust the National Party to understand that.
Do you trust Jim Bolger?
And I trust him to understand that, and vice versa. For if we cannot get that clear, then we are all wasting our time.
Do you trust him?
Oh, yes. I'm working with Winston on a basis of complete trust that we have to have. If he and I don't trust each other as leader and deputy leader of the coalition government, then it won't work.
This is a fine deal. You know why?
And that's what this is all about. It's a political marriage of convenience. It's a relationship where they have to trust each other. But how long will it last? Probably as long as it has to.
Sorry, Dr. Honourable Michael Callum.
That assignment program was broadcast on 19 December 1996. The next story comes from the TVNZ collection held by Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision.
On 28 February 1977, Queen Elizabeth opened the new executive wing, otherwise known as the Beehive, of the Parliament buildings. The construction of the Beehive took 10 years to complete, from 1969 to 1979.
She's accompanied by the Prime Minister, Mr Muldoon, Duke of Edinburgh behind her there, today wearing the uniform of the Admiral of the Fleet. The whole area is crowded with people who are hoping for a closer glimpse. And now guests are being presented to her. The first thing to strike any visitor descending or ascending the marble staircase that we've just seen is the explosion of colour that's the woven tapestry designed by artist Guy Nahn and woven by Joan Calvert. Brilliant colours, predominating shades of green, with sunbursts of reds, yellows and oranges radiating from the junction of its T shape. The whole's specially designed to let you glimpse the beautiful Takaka marble background. It's noticeable today that not many people have curtsied to Her Majesty. I wonder why.
It is my honour and privilege, on behalf of your government and the people of New Zealand, to ask you to unveil a plaque commemorating the opening of the new executive wing of Parliament Buildings. During Your Majesty's visits to our country, you have unveiled other plaques and placed foundation stones, but this will be the first bearing the inscription, "The Queen of New Zealand." This building stands on historic ground. Here, Colonel Wakefield, agent for the New Zealand Company, built his home shortly after 1840. It was in later years used as a centre of one of our provincial governments, but these were abolished just over a century ago. The seat of central government was transferred from Auckland to Wellington in 1865, a decision which is still in contention. And after Wakefield's residence was demolished in 1869, the first government house here was built on this site. The concept of this executive wing is that of Sir Basil Spence, a British architect of international standing. His concept was developed by the Government Architects Division of the New Zealand Ministry of Works. The wing is being built and furnished almost entirely of New Zealand materials, including marble, granite, timber, and carpet. There is, however, a special link with England. During World War I, most New Zealand servicemen invalided from the Western Front were patients in Walton-on-Thames Hospital in Surrey. That hospital was situated in what is now Elmbridge Borough, which has a number of streets commemorating associations with New Zealand. After that war, New Zealand presented Elmbridge Borough with native rimu for panelling in its council chamber. When the Elmbridge Council learned that this executive wing was to be built, it presented the New Zealand government with oak from which the ministerial dining room furniture has been made. I now respectfully ask Your Majesty to unveil the commemorative plaque, and that done, to accept from us a Copenhagen porcelain plate depicting the Beehive as the executive wing has come to be known.
Mr. Prime Minister, when I was here in 1974, this new executive wing of Parliament Buildings had only been built to ground level. Now, although there is still much to be done to it, the bold, imaginative and impressive design is evident. I congratulate the architects, the contractors, the craftsmen and all concerned on what has been achieved. Here in the Beehive, the executive functions of government will be carried on. Men and women are always affected by the surroundings in which they work. Well, it is hard to imagine a better image for those who serve the people than the honest and industrious honeybee. I am sure it will be so in this fine building, which I now have much pleasure in declaring open.
Although the building has been opened, really it's only the first 3 levels there are at already. It'll be another 18 months before the complex is completed and it becomes, as it were, the hub of the nation. In 1964, the then government discussed planned extensions to Parliament buildings, and the question was whether to extend the existing building, unfinished since 1918, tear it down and start from scratch, or develop something in a contemporary style to fit in with the surroundings. They opted for the vision of one man, British architect Sir Basil Spence, who felt that what was needed was a bold design to stand out among all the high-rise buildings going up, but still provide a visual link with the existing Parliament. His then was the concept, and despite some controversial reaction and what appeared to be bad feeling between the New Zealand government and Sir Basil after they'd given the job of developing it to the government architect and the Ministry of Works, the building was begun in 1969. First to go was the old wooden building that stood on the site of Wakefield's house. At this time, it housed Bellamy's and assorted offices. The excavations were started and they dug deep for this building. The circular design was felt to be functionally efficient with lots of much-needed space. Very soon, its distinctive shape was apparent, but the construction work was all underground in this first stage. The massive foundations had to be earthquake-proof, and deep below street level is an intricate arrangement of suites for civil defence headquarters, packed with everything for a national emergency. By 1971, the idea was becoming a reality. A complex construction employing an average of 100 men a day, and in time to dwarf the nearby cenotaph. It's a very solid building on a sort of massive raft foundation of 6,000 yards of concrete and 800 tons of steel, 9 feet thick. The circular section's built around a core, 2 feet thick. By now, the basement garage is complete and the design looks like a giant wheel, spokes radiating from the center. At this stage, it's hard to realize that floors will rise in ever-decreasing circles, but all the activity on the site is somehow reminiscent of a beehive in full production. The building gets its name from everyday Beehive brand matchboxes, which evidently Sir Basil Spence used to show Sir Keith Holyoake what he intended to design for the new building. 1973, and Wellingtonians couldn't ignore the new presence. There it was, and it was as if Destiny as well as the Ministry of Works had had a hand in this distinctive design. Back in 1911 there was a competition to design the Parliament buildings, and one of the drawings submitted was in fact a circular library to stand on this exact spot. For a while, of course, there was concern that the Beehive's costs might become exorbitant, not surprising in these inflationary times, and that it could be another Sydney Opera House. In fact, this hasn't happened, and although it's far from inexpensive, there's cautious optimism that it might not be much over $15 million. 1974, and the first of the 30 concrete beams was put into place, and the exterior facing on the podium, Coromandel granite, was put on. It could be said that every ship has its engine room, even the ship of state. Here all heating, cooling and generating begins. This air conditioning plant is one of the biggest in the country, and there are standby diesel generators to allow business as usual in case of a power cut. This is in fact the heart of the building. Even the lift machinery is here, unusual, as in other buildings it operates from the roof, but that would interfere with the architectural line and the natural light for the cabinet room on the 9th floor, hence the radical innovation. There are 7 lifts, 4 public, 1 for Bellamy's, 1 for the ministers, and a special one just for the Prime Minister, programmed to go up to his floor immediately the division bells ring. If you and I take the lifts to the top floors, we'll be travelling up the central core and won't have the splendid view of the city and harbour that the construction workers have every day. But it's not for those inclined to vertigo, and the somewhat primitive lift doesn't give the smoothest of rides. Let's hope the ministers will arrive at the top with less of a jolt at the cabinet room where all the decisions are made. The cabinet room is still open to the sky, as you can see, but it is the seat of power, with the sort of view you'd expect from the top. Perhaps the most distinctive features after the shape are the 800 fins, designed not just to keep things cool in the cabinet room, but throughout the building. They're to reduce solar heat gain and provide shade in the offices. Above the cabinet room, the wooden frame of the roof, a structure to be covered with copper, ultimately a visual greenish crown. Cabinet ministers, who for so long have endured cramped and far from luxurious accommodations, will find their patience rewarded. Along with the view, they'll have suites with offices for secretaries, waiting rooms and shower facilities. Hard to visualise now, but a comfortably furnished reality by 1978. Even the inner man is catered for with restrained luxury. There's a discreet opulence about the ministerial dining room, pale gold velvet chairs, and a table designed to blend with the building's curve. Made here in oak, a gift from the borough of Elmbridge. Members, too, dine in comfort on food from the new Bellamy's kitchens. The colour scheme throughout is dark brown to complement all the native wood used. Carpet, specially designed crown linen dinnerware, wool furnishings and pottery. All New Zealand made. The Queen returns to the Beehive this evening for the state dinner. That'll be in the curved banqueting hall. The room covers 5,000 square feet and will seat 300 people. It's a great sweep of glass, the whole height of the main drum. As you can see, the tables are all set for this evening's state banquet. Wellington's architect mayor sums it all up as a magnificent complex, symbolic of the past structure of government. At last, a really distinctive landmark that Wellington can call its own.